Well, good morning, Active Church. My name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors here, and we are honored that you would come and hang out with us here in the room. And if you're watching online, we're glad that you're watching online. How's everybody feeling this morning? Doing good? That's great. That's great. We are in the middle of a series called Active Church is Worldly, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I just want to re-emphasize that we are just 2 weeks away from the best weekend of the year. Easter weekend is coming, and we have some incredible things planned. That we have something on Friday night for Good Friday at 6:30 in this place, a night of reflection. We're going to lean in on what the cross means and what Jesus did for us on the cross, and then a completely different experience on Sunday at 9, 10:45, and at 12:30. And we're going to celebrate the resurrection and announce that this is for love. If you're thinking about getting baptized, Easter Sunday is actually our next baptism service. And so we want to encourage you to sign up for that. There's a card in your seat back. If you're watching online, you can comment or send us a direct message and let us know that you're interested in getting baptized. You could take that card to Guest Central today. And the reason why I want you to be aware of what's going on Easter weekend is we are expecting over 3,000 people to join us. And we want to be a place where our hands and our hearts and our arms are open. And so if you are, we could celebrate that, right? If you are not yet involved in some sort of serving capacity, we would love for you to join our team and be involved in serving, especially on Easter. And so today, if you would, go to the Guest Central kiosk that's just under the gazebo. Our Prepare Leaders Pastor Shauna will be there, and she would love to connect you to an opportunity to serve on Easter weekend, all right? This series, Active Church is Worldly, is an opportunity for us to redefine the word worldly. Worldly always has this negative connotation to it, but Jesus said that we are to be in the world and not of it. And what we're focusing on is what it means to be in this world. As a church, as God's people, how do we lean in and be for the world? We started a few weeks ago by announcing that this message and this God is for everyone, and how everyone includes you, and how everyone includes them, and how in this message it is an announcement of life-changing, life-giving truth. Which brings us to this morning, and the announcement that this is for peace, that God made a decision a long time ago, a decision that other gods that were believed in would never make and would never announce, that the one true God made a decision about you and about me that was a game changer for our relationship with Him. And because of that decision, it influenced us, and God invites us to make the same decision for those that we are for those that are in the world, for those that are not here yet. And so I want to talk about that decision that God made. I want to talk about how it shaped and formed us. And then I want to invite you to a really significant decision, one that could be a game changer for your relationships, and as you announce that you and your church is for the world. My daughter Riley is 9, and she is a gift giver. Her love language is gift giving. I have a drawer at home that is filled with pictures and drawings and notes to the point where I can hardly get the drawer open. So the other day I decided that I needed to maybe eliminate some of the clutter in the drawer, but I needed to do it discreetly. And so I went in and I grabbed some notes that maybe were a little bit older, maybe a little bit torn up, and I went and I threw them in what I thought was the safe trash can. And my daughter saw it. And she goes, "Daddy, what's up with that? Who put those notes in the trash?" And I responded like any good husband would. Mom did. Must have been Mom. Riley understood after I explained to her why. She understood after I explained why I needed to throw them away. And then she went into her room and she colored pictures and wrote more notes and said, "Here, fill your drawer back up again." For my birthday, she wrote me this note. And in this note, if you can read it, she talks about how I'm the greatest, just so you know. She talks about how I'm the best dad ever, just so you know. And she talks about how I always make her smile and laugh. I'm kind, I'm funny, I'm wonderful. And then she ends it with, "I'm the greatest dad ever." Poor thing, I've got her totally manipulated, don't I? Here's the best part about this note. is I don't have to question where I stand with Riley. She's announced it. She let me know. And when it comes to our relationships with one another, isn't it great when we know where we stand? Where we're not having to constantly work for it? I've said many, many times in my almost 16 years of marriage that I'm so glad that I'm married to a wife that lets me know where I stand. And I would never want to go back to dating ever again because I wasn't good at it in the first place. I don't know how I was able to win my wife over, but it just announces that there is a God, okay? Thank you. The truth is that with Riley, I never have to question where I stand. And when it comes to our relationships with each other, isn't it great when we don't have to question where we stand, that that's not even a thought in our head? And when it comes to God, God announces where we stand. See, religion is interesting. Religion says, do this and you'll receive that, possibly, maybe, potentially. There are people that live lives, go to church, participate in whatever religious perspective they participate in, and they're constantly hoping that this is good enough, that they are actually appeasing God and honoring God, but they're not really sure. This is what religion announces. There are people today that are showing up to their church, their perspective, and they're hoping that it's good enough. They have their fingers crossed, but they never quite know how God feels about them. And this is why Jesus is reckless. Jesus announces that I love you and I expect nothing back. Now, would he like something back? Absolutely. Does he extend to you all of his love and all of his grace and all of his mercy? Absolutely. But the reckless part of Jesus, or what would seem like it's reckless, is that Jesus allows you to say yes or no to him. That he extends every part of who he is to you and to me. And then says, and now you have a decision to make. And I just want you to know that whatever decision you make, it doesn't change how I feel about you or where you stand with me. It was Jesus that announces to all of his followers, one in particular, John, wrote down this announcement about this decision he made. And he said, greater love has no one than this, that he lay his life down for his friends. The greatest thing that we could do for one another, the greatest expression of love, is to live sacrificially. And Jesus modeled that for us. He said the highest priority of love, the greatest expression of love, is him giving his life for us. And not just doing it because he thought it would be awesome, but doing it because it solved the sin problem in us. The problem that you and I can't figure out. The problem that you and I are overwhelmed by. Jesus says that's the greatest expression of love. And then look what he calls us. Friends. Not peons, not munchkins, not servants, right? He says to us, you're my friends. And then he goes on and says that my friends do what I've invited them to do. You never have to question where you stand with someone when they're willing to die for you. You never have to question where you stand with someone when they're willing to die for you. And maybe that's the first time that you have heard that. Or maybe you heard it for the first time in a long time. And doesn't it just cause you to go, because we have a lot of things that are going on in our head, don't we? And we don't want one more thing in our brain because we have so much anxiety in this world. I saw this meme recently, maybe you've seen it too, of a woman giving a presentation about what it means to be a parent in 2017. And she says, make sure your child's academic, emotional, social, mental, spiritual, physical, nutritional, and social needs are met by being careful not to overstimulate, understimulate, improperly medicate, helicopter neglect, or even give them free screen time, processed foods, GMO-free, negative energy, plastic-free, body-positive, socially conscious, egalitarian, but also authoritative, nurturing but fostering independence, gentle but not overly permissive, pesticide-free, two-story, multilingual, preferably in a cul-de-sac with a backyard, 1.5 siblings, spaced at least 2 years apart for proper development, and also don't forget coconut oil. Whew, can we all just on 3 just breathe out? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Whoa, right? Because that's how life feels. I love that the next slide, I actually circled it for you. The next slide says, being a parent in literally every other generation, feed them sometimes. Right? Throw them a banana or a cookie. It'll be great. But this is how we live life often, isn't it? We've got so much anxiety, so much tension. And God says to us, you don't have to worry about where you stand with me. That doesn't even need to be something that you even need to think about, because I have announced for all time where you stand with me. In fact, one writer says, be anxious about nothing. Do not be anxious about this, and do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, with prayer and petition, conversation with God, relationship with God, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And I love this next line. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Your hearts represent all of your emotions, and your minds represent all the ways that you think. And God says, listen, the one thing that you don't need to worry about is where you stand with me. And then he says, for those of you that have said yes to me, I have a challenge for you. I have a command for you, is to do what I have done in your life for those that are in yours. That what I've given to you, may it be for them also. He says, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. I've modeled it for you. It's been on display in front of you. You've heard my words, you've seen my actions, and do that very same thing for those that you are in relationship with, for those that are not here yet. And then he gives us marching orders, a really great way forward. How do we show and display and model this love for the world? When Jesus resurrected from the grave, he took his followers about 40 to 50 days later up on a mountain, and he announced to them what's called the Great Commission, where he sends them out and he says, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them everything I have commanded you. The phrase go literally means as you're living. Make disciples, draw them. They'll be convicted, not condemned. They'll be drawn, not coerced. You are to live in such a way that people will come over to the edge and peer over and go, man, I don't know if I believe that, but I would want my kids to marry somebody like that. I don't know if I believe that, but I would hire you because of who you are and what you're like. Jesus says, invite them in, make disciples, draw them in, and have them understand what it is that God has done for you. He is also going to do for them. The problem is that often when people are asked about Christians and about the church and what they represent and how they come into the world and engage in relationship, it doesn't feel a lot like this. Their answers are usually these: that they're hypocritical, they don't do what they say that they will do. They're hateful, that there are certain people that they like, and then there are certain people that they don't like. And they're selfish, they keep everything closed. Their hearts are closed, their hands are closed, their arms are closed. Steve Jobs once wrote that the juice goes out of Christianity when it becomes too based on faith rather than on living like Jesus or seeing the world as Jesus saw it. He's not bashing faith. What he's bashing is that when faith just stays here and never moves here. When faith just stays here and never moves here. When faith just stays here and never moves there. What he's saying is that the juice goes out when we decide that we're just going to be people that show up and call ourselves something and yet never do anything about it. And what Jesus would announce to us is we are a church that is worldly, that's for the world, that he is a God that's worldly, that's for the world. Jesus would say, to be for the world, we must be for love. We must be for love. And to be for the world, we must show love. It can't be something that we just talk about. It must be something that we display. And to be for the world, it must be God's love. Because I could love you, but I'm fickle. When the angels play, I love the Angels. I'm a fan of that team. And when they play and they win, I watch. And when they play and they don't win, I don't watch. But God's love isn't fickle. God's love loves you whether you've said yes or no to him. God announces where you stand with him, whether you've said yes or no to him, because he doesn't want that to be something that you're anxious about, that God is for you, even if you stand against him. And the question that we are answering in this series as a church, as people of Jesus, as people who are intrigued and interested by Jesus, the question that we're answering for ourselves is, where do you stand with me? Where do you stand with me? Where does the world stand with me? Because God has removed all anxiety, because he answered that question with a resounding, "This is how I feel about you." It's for everyone. I've died for everyone. I've resurrected for everyone. And everyone is invited. And then he invites us to answer that same question in the relationships that we have with those that aren't here yet. That we have the opportunity to lower the anxiety. That's not even a question they're asking anymore. It was John, one of the early followers of Jesus, that said, "There is no fear in love." The problem is that often this message that inspires us and has changed us, this message can get messed up as we go into all the world. And it doesn't sound like the Great Commission. It really sounds like we're trying to greatly convince people in ways that aren't awesome and great. Maybe the Great Commission, the way that the church lives, sounds a little bit more like this: "Go and impose my teaching, values, and worldviews on all nations, threatening them with judgment and destruction if they don't obey everything I have commanded you." To which many of us would go, "Man, if that was taking place, I would notice it, and I would speak up, and I would stand up, and I would stop it." And I believe you. I do. The problem is that this often shows up in very subtle, ordinary ways. Anybody like Starbucks? Starbucks addicts in the room? Hello, my name is Michael. Okay. Do you remember when Starbucks released their Christmas cups? You're all laughing because you know where we're going with this, don't you? They released their Christmas cups, and there was a group of Christians that were really upset, that they felt like Starbucks was violating the spirit of the season, and they were removing Christmas. And so there were some Christians that boycotted Starbucks. And then there were other Christians that went into Starbucks and said that their name was Merry Christmas, so that the barista would have to write Merry Christmas on the cup. Here's the problem. I'm a big fan of Christmas. It's essential to the story of Jesus. It's how Jesus came. It's how hope arrived. But you know what that feels like? It feels like this: go and impose. Just because an organization decides that maybe perhaps they're not going to celebrate Christmas does not give us the right to say that they have to. And just because an organization may not believe the way that we believe doesn't give us the right to enforce and threaten. And I get why some people made those decisions, and this is not to throw down judgment on them. This is just to say that often it shows up in very subtle ways where we've missed the mark, where instead of drawing them, we're coercing them. Where instead of convicting them with our words and with our actions, we're condemning them. And anytime we leverage power over love, we go backwards instead of forwards. Somewhere the message, God is love, got converted to God will get you. Here he comes. So you better be careful, right? And maybe we need to adjust our questions. Maybe we need to stop asking the question, what will I require of them? And start asking the question, what does love require of me? Because that's what Jesus did. And he announced, while we were still in our sin, that he loved us through his death. That while we were still doing what we want, that he loved us and gave of his life. That while we were in rebellion against him, While we were standing against him, Jesus was for us and said, you don't never have to worry about where you stand with me because I love you. I love you. I love you. That's not going to be a hurdle you have to jump over. I have come to bring and to speak peace in that part of our relationship. You want to know what love requires of us? One of the early writers of the New Testament, his name was Paul, wrote this to a church in Corinth, and he said, I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might win some. You ever been won? Maybe it was a contract in a business and they gave you a great contract and then they actually fulfilled the contract and then you said, I'm gonna go back. You've got a customer for life. Or maybe it was a house, you were purchasing a house and the realtor or the people that were selling you the house, or maybe both, they just did everything they could to draw you in and make this situation the most important situation, the most attractive situation, and you went, man, anytime I recommend somebody, I'm gonna recommend them. Anytime I go and look for a house, I'm gonna talk to them. Or maybe it was relationally. I remember when my wife and I were interested in dating. We hadn't actually talked about it and we weren't actually dating, but we were interested and we both knew, but we never talked about it because we were mature. And there was a night, now some of you are catching up, okay, great. There was a night where we hung out with a bunch of college students from this church. There was about 30 of us. And we went out to dinner. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it because my job had extended me and I had to continue to work. And so later that night, I actually went over and talked with some of the guys that were in that group. And these guys couldn't wait to talk to me. I asked them how the night went, and they said, oh, Mike, it was awesome, and we're so bummed that you missed. And I said, why? What happened? And they said, we set up chairs all around the table, and Tiff made sure that there was one empty chair next to her. Because just in case if you showed up, you would have to sit next to her. And they said that she was so adamant about this, like she threatened the lives of people that would try to sit there. The fascinating part was we had about 30 people in our group. By the end of the night, there was only 27. And she waited for me to show up. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it, but they said that she had this space open for me. And I'll tell you, there was nothing like that for me. She likes me. She really likes me. And she was winning my heart. And what Paul is saying here is that we live in such a way that draws people, convicts people. And then he takes us to a moment in this very church in Corinth, in a city that was really like the Vegas of the time. And I don't mean to put down Vegas, but I think you know what I mean, that there were some things that went on that nobody would talk about, nobody wanted to talk about. And there's this church in this city. And in his interaction with this church, he gives us the decision that you and I could make that could announce for all time that we are for the world and that this is for peace. This decision could be a game changer in your relationships with people that see the world differently than you. This decision could be a life changer in the relationships with those in the world that see it differently than you. And Paul, in order for us to understand this, he does two things. He categorizes two groups of people. He calls them insiders and outsiders. And he says that the church people are the insiders and that the non-church people are the outsiders. And this was not to say that one is better than the other. This is not to say that one is greater than the other. He's just using this to identify how we interact with one another, those of you that are in church, and how we interact with those that are not here yet. And the thing that he addresses with the insiders is pretty awesome. It's actually it teases us to want to know what it is. And he addresses it in a way that says, we cannot allow this to stand because we are better than this. He writes this. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you that does not occur even among the pagans. Now, pagans is just a word that they used during that time to signify that these people didn't believe in any sort of God. Paul writes to this church, which is probably 30, 40, 50 people. And he says that there is activity in your midst that even the pagans would go, okay, well, that's crossing the line. You ever been in a situation where even the worst possible influence on you goes, maybe we shouldn't do that? And you go, man, I really must be violating. I really must be headed to hell if I'm going to make the decision and they're questioning it, right? Paul says that there is even something happening among you that the pagans would not be excited about. And now you want to know, don't you? Now you're like, shut up, Mike, move on to the next thing. What is it that's happening in that church? You ready? He says, a man has his father's wife. Now, some theologians believe that this isn't his actual mother, that his father divorced from his mother and perhaps remarried. And maybe that relationship is still together, or maybe that relationship is over, but what Paul is addressing is that this man has that woman. And then he says to the group of people, and you haven't said a word about it. You haven't gone to them. You haven't had a conversation. You're just allowing it to take place. This isn't a good story. This isn't what we are about. And then he says something really significant. He says, I have already passed judgment on the one who did this. To which many of us would go, time out, time out, time out. Judgment? Doesn't the Bible say not to judge, Paul? And Paul would respond, no, because I'm writing the Bible. That's what I'm doing. Listen, the Bible doesn't tell you not to judge, it tells you who to judge. But when you think of judgment, it might be different than what Paul is talking about. Because the word that he uses could be summarized this way, to remind. I'm going to remind you of who you are. I'm going to remind you of where you stand. And I'm going to remind you of the God that loves you. And hopefully that reminder leads to a moment where we can reconcile, where there's apologies given and forgiveness that's offered and restitution that's made. And ultimately you are reconciled with God, that you're not standing against him anymore because he never stands against you. And that it would lead to you living a life fully restored. That you're back in the community, and we don't bring that up. We don't go, hey, 5 years ago, remember what Bob did? Oh, Bob, you're weird. We don't bring it up because it's forgiven. It's cleansed. It's washed. And what he does here in this moment is he says, this is how you interact with the insiders, because he wants to give us great clarity in how we act towards the outsiders. And remember, those titles are just to make categories, not to say one is better than the other. And then Paul invites us to make a decision about how we are going to see the world. And in this decision, we announce where you stand with me. He says, I've written to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. So there was a previous letter that came that didn't make it into the Bible, but there's a previous letter that we don't have, where Paul says, I let you know that you are not to hang out with sexually immoral people. But the problem was is they took that as they can't hang out with anybody that's sinful. Anybody that chooses to sin, they can't hang out with them. And so Paul had to clarify that. And he says, not at all, meaning all the people of this world. It's not what I said. In that case, you would have to leave the world. The people that you're hanging out with, you'd have to not talk to them. That's not what I was intending. And the problem was is that they got really self-righteous, and they decided that we are not going to associate with people that are not a part of the church, and that we are not going to associate with those people that don't love Jesus, and we are not going to associate. And it became an us versus them. And Paul goes, that is not who you are, and that is not how we live. We don't go and impose, we go and make. We don't coerce, we draw. We don't condemn, we convict. That's who we are. And then he asks a question that invites us to make a decision. And he says, in this question, we communicate, if we say we're going to do this thing, we communicate for all time that we are for the world. And here's this question. What business is it of mine to judge or condemn those outside of the church. What business is it of mine to judge, to condemn, to put down those outside of the church? And the answer to that question is none of your business. And this is why he wanted to be very clear when we're talking to the insiders and when we're talking to the outsiders, when we're talking to people who have surrendered their life to Jesus and when we're talking to people who have not done that yet. He says that you will bring peace in your relationship with those in the world when you stop doing this. When you stop condemning them with your words and with your actions. When you stop expecting them to behave like you. Bob Goff wrote a book called Everybody, Always. And there's a portion of his book that just moved me as he talked about how we engage those who are not here yet. And he writes this: it's our job. It's always been our job. We're supposed to just love the people in front of us. We're the ones who tell them who they are. We don't need to spend as much time as we do telling people what we think about what they're doing. We're not the school principals or the bouncers or the sheriffs. In other words, stop it. Loving people doesn't mean we need to control their conduct. There's a big difference between the two. Loving people means caring without an agenda. As soon as we have an agenda, it's not love anymore. It's acting like you care to get someone to do what you want or what you think God wants them to do. Do less of that, and people will see a lot less of you and more of Jesus. What he's saying here is love doesn't expect non-Jesus followers to behave like Jesus followers. But love does expect Jesus followers to behave like Jesus followers. They don't expect non-Jesus followers to behave like Jesus followers, but they do expect Jesus followers to behave like Jesus followers. And Paul says that you can announce to the world where they stand with you when you stop expecting them to live in a way that they haven't committed themselves to yet. Would we like for them to commit themselves to this? You better believe it. Do we think that this is the best way to live? You better believe it. Is there incredible hope and grace and mercy in this place? You better believe it. But they're not there yet. And here's the thing. This is what God did for you. This is why you showed up to church for the very first time today, or maybe for the very first time in a long time, or why you started coming to church. Because God announced that there isn't a hoop that you have to jump through, there isn't a hurdle that you have to try to get over, that God loves you, He loves you, He loves you. And you don't have to worry about that. And the step that you can take is into love, where God announces that you don't have to live like that. There is a better way. And Paul summarizes it this way. He says, are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. And don't let that word judge throw you. Don't let it feel condemning. Because the word literally means to hold to the standard of love. For those that I'm in relationship with that are followers of Jesus, and for those that I'm in relationship with that are not, I will hold to the standard of love. What does love require of me? The way that this looks can show up in different ways, and I saw it show up in a really significant way a few years ago. How many of you have ever seen the TV show The View? Anybody? A few of you, that's great. There's like grumbles in the room. We're not going to talk about it politically. We're just going to talk about the show for a second. Here's the thing. There was a situation on The View where a pastor and his wife, a guy named Mark Driscoll and his wife, showed up a few years ago, and they had written a book together called Real Marriage. And they were having a discussion about marriage on this show and how biblical marriage looks and how covenant looks and how commitment looks and how God's love holds this thing together. And they covered all areas, and they got to the conversation about sexual intimacy. And then Whoopi Goldberg asked a really, really important question. She said this: I just have to ask, because you're always talking a lot about being married. Now, if you are widowed and you meet somebody and you don't want to get married again, are you saying that the widow or widower should just go without because God doesn't like it? Is that what you're saying? And there's a few ways to answer this. The first way is, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what the Bible says, that this is what they should do. There's a second way to answer it. Well, I think, right? We kind of fumble over it, right? Or there's a third way to answer it, and Mark answered this brilliantly. He said this: I worship a guy who died and rose as a virgin. So that example would be that someone can live a full, great life without being sexually active. See, Mary gets all the virgin press. But you like that one? Okay, great. But here's what we need to know about Jesus, is that he lived and died and was resurrected as a virgin. He didn't engage in sexual intimacy because he was not a married man. He was God. And what Mark says is that he worships a guy who died and rose as a virgin. And then what I love is he says, so that would be an example that, and what's the word? Someone, not everyone. You don't have to, you can. But someone can live a full, great life without being sexually active. He creates a category that it's possible because he recognizes that he's speaking to a group of people that have yet to surrender their lives to Jesus. And so he doesn't say, this is what you have to do. He says, someone's able to do it. So then Whoopi asks a really great question. She says, how's that work? How does that work? And then Mark's wife, Grace, speaks up. And she says this: we, in our church, know a lot of widows, actually, and single moms, and they are very happy. They have a relationship with Jesus. And she continues, they are very happy serving other people, and they can be content. If they desire to have sexual relations again when they get married, yes, but they can be content without that. Not you and have to. She says, they. Mark said, someone. They created a category that it's possible. And what they were doing was causing Whoopi and the whole team and people watching to peer over the edge and go, that's interesting. That's powerful. I'm intrigued by that. This is the power in our decision to choose not to expect from non-Jesus followers what Jesus followers would do. And when we communicate that, we announce over them where they stand with us. Drawn, not coerced. Convicted, not condemned. And when we do this, we're answering, where do you stand with me? Where do you, those that have not yet trusted in Jesus, where do you stand with me? And what we announce when we make a decision to not throw down condemnation, to not throw down judgment, but to live a life that convicts and stirs, to live a life that draws, what we announce is that you are loved. And love brings peace. That you are loved. And love brings peace. And so maybe for you, you need to change your question. Maybe your question was always, what will I require of them? What will I make them do? And maybe today you could adjust that question. What does love require of me? That I will expect Jesus followers to live like Jesus followers. And I will not expect non-Jesus followers to live like Jesus followers. That I will be somebody in my relationships with those inside and outside. I will be somebody that always announces where they stand with me, that my hands and my heart and my arms are wide open. Because I believe that God is writing a better story. And I believe that God is going to radically change a heart And there are people in your life that would be considered part of the world. And if we are a church and if we are people that are for the world, then we will ask a better question. What does love require of me? Maybe the answer is simply that we are going to love better on the inside, and we're going to give up judging those on the outside. Love better on the inside, and give up judging those on the outside. One more time. Love better on the inside, and give up judging those on the outside, because that is worldly. Let me pray for us. God, this truth can be a bit unsettling for some, and this truth can be inspiring for others. But this truth is life-changing. It's life-changing because we are announcing where they stand with us. And the only reason why we're doing this, God, is because you announced it first. You let us know where we stand with you by sending your Son to come and to die and to rise. So God, may we take that message full and complete to the world that we love and we believe needs your hope and your grace and your forgiveness. In Jesus' name.